Okay, shall I kick us off with a karakia?
Yeah, thank you.
Kia tau, tau ana te mauri, tau ana te wairua. Tukua mai te manawa nui, tukua mai te manawa roa. Arahina mai, mana ki tia mai. Kimihia te huarahi o te maramatanga, whaia te huarahi o te mātauranga. Kia puta mai I te pō, ki te whaiau, ki te ao marama. Tihei, Māori ora. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming along to this webinar. I'm Emma Geeson, Planting Partnerships Manager for Trees That Count, and am joined by Dr. Fiona Eade, who will present this webinar outlining the results of the work the Tasman District Council's been doing to revegetate Teapot Valley after the fires there in 2019. In the context of the devastating fires still underway now in Tongariro National Park. And our thoughts go out to all of those affected and those fighting the fires. And as we head into the summer and the risk of fire increases, this webinar is timely and offers some hope for restoring the ngahere and some practical advice based on excellent trials and monitoring undertaken by Tasman District Council. Before I hand it over to Fiona, it'd be great to see who's out there with us today. So if you're keen, please put your name and organisation in the chat, and feel free to post questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we will address those at the end. So for now, over to you, Fiona.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Emma. I'm hoping that all of you can see the first slide. So today I'm talking about sowing the seeds of success and restoring native forests after fire. So for those of you that don't know, I'm Fiona Eade, contract to Tasman District Council. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the project that we established. It was a 4-year project with the council, mainly funded by Te Ururako, the New Zealand Forest Service, and Tasman Pine Forests Ltd. And TPFL are the forest owners. They own the plantation forest and the area that Teapot Valley sits in. And talk a little bit about the Pigeon Valley fire and why we focused on Teapot Valley, and briefly mention some of the project activities. But what I really want to focus on today is the work that we've done with natural regeneration and with direct seeding. Pigeon Valley fire was a significant event here in Tasman. It started in early February 2019, took several days to fully control. It burnt across about 2,400 hectares, primarily of plantation forest, but also pasture and native forest areas. It was significant locally, but in the national context, it was also a big fire. At the time, it was the 3rd largest fire known in New Zealand. Unfortunately, the Tongariro fire is somewhat bigger, and because of the ecosystems that it's burnt, is a hugely significant fire. Within the native forest areas that were affected by the Pigeon Valley fire, we had Teapot Valley, which was an area of about 60 hectares, which was dominated by native forest pre-fire. For those of you that aren't local to this part of the world, we've got Takaka here, Nelson here, Blenheim off to the right of screen. We're in the top of the south in Tasman. There's a little town here called Wakefield. That Wakefield was kind of the eastern edge of the fire, and the little red dot above it is where Teapot Valley is situated. It's a relatively small valley, small catchment, but it is highly significant because pre-fire there was a high-quality remnant of one of our rare ecosystems, the lowland alluvial beach polycarp forest. And that's rare because it's lowland and alluvial. So these are the forests that would have been cleared in early colonisation. Thankfully, through the fire, it wasn't burnt. These areas are mainly on the valley floor and were reasonably protected. The riparian areas and wetlands that we have in the site were also relatively undamaged by the fire. But where we had the most damage was in these hill slopes areas here. So this was host to primarily beech forest with some podocarps, things like rimu in particular, and this is where we had a lot of damage. But what I want you to focus on is the areas in green, and this is the intact forest. So we've got our alluvial forest down here through the river valley, and so we still had some good remnants. So it was worth actually focusing on this area to do our restoration. In any restoration project, it's really helpful to know what your baseline is, what's the condition of the ecosystems that you're working with when you start. So we did some monitoring in 2021 before we got underway with the actual field work and assessed the baseline, came back 3 years later and reassessed the same plots. 3 years in the context of restoration is not a long time. Ideally, you wouldn't probably come back for 5 or 10 years to do your assessments. But we were constrained by the length of time for the project. We set up a series of plots and assessed the mid-story cover, understory cover, and recruitment of woody species along transects and using quadrats. And we assessed this for both native and exotic vegetation. We did this in intact forests, so you can see here measuring the mid-story and intact vegetation. And this is an open area with no canopy cover. And we also wanted to know what was happening on the forest edges. These are kind of the dynamic transition zones. I'm not going to talk about any of the results from this work, but what I will point you to is that we've written a fairly comprehensive report about all of this work, and the monitoring aspect of that is in part 1 of that report, and I'll talk you through how to get hold of that at the end of the talk. One of the key activities within the project was planting. So in 2022, 23 and 24, through the winters, we planted more than 33,000 native plants, some of which were provided through funding from Trees That Count. We planted across about 11 hectares and 51 different species. So in the map on the top, you can see the different colour coding that relates to the year in which things were planted. And if we focus in on some of these lime green areas planted in 2022, these are the areas that were mostly affected by the fire. And so we were planting the pioneer species, various shrubs like Manuka carnuka, Pittosporums, Ahebes or Veronicas, Coprosmas, and a few trees such as Totara. So the photo at the bottom is a 3-year-old Veronica salicifolia, or Koromiko. Some of you may know it as one of our Ahebes. So things are doing pretty well there. Where we had existing stands of native vegetation or on the edges, along the gullies and at the bottom of the hill slopes, where we had a bit of cover, we increased the diversity that we planted. And so that meant that we could get in a whole range of different species. And then in the wetlands, we were planting things like our caryxes, harakiki, kahikatea, and swamp coprosma. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about any of the data we've collected about survival or growth. That's in the final report in part 3. But what I do want to focus on is really what the ecological underpinning of our planting decisions was around. And it was really around making connections across the landscape. So we had intact vegetation, as I say, on the valley floor. We also had reasonable vegetation in some of the gullies. And so these gullies were now separated by hill slopes where the forest had been burnt. So we went in and replanted those hill slopes so we could connect up those gullies again. So in the top picture, we've got a gully here with some native veg in it. This photo is taken in 2022, where we've just finished our replanting. Coming back 3 years later, the same gully, looking from slightly further back, we're getting our planted species are doing all right, but we're also getting a bit of native regen happening, and we are starting to make those connections across the across the landscape. By decreasing that fragmentation and increasing that connectivity, what we do is we increase the resilience and the health of our forest. The Teapot Valley site is quite sinuous, there's a lot of edges. So what we were trying to do was to increase the area and decrease the edges so that we had a healthier forest that's going to be more resistant, for example, to weed invasion. In the wetland areas, we cleared a heap of weeds out of the wetlands themselves, but we also cleared around the wetlands. We've got existing forest that kind of bookends our wetlands. And so the idea was to increase the health of those forest areas. So in this particular photo, you can see a stand of kahikatea and a whole range of other species. Our swamp coprosmas, this kind of tangled brown shrub here. Narrow-leaved hohere or lacebark here. So what we were doing was trying to strengthen that connection between our wetland and the forest adjacent to increase health. And planting things like a harakiki. So this had been planted in 2024 and is doing pretty well. We do have a few issues with weeds, unsurprisingly. In the intact forest, one of the weeds that we have particular problems with here in the top of the south is old man's beard. You can see in the photo on the right that we've got a crew member cutting. So we cut and paint the old vines. Thankfully, we don't kind of have this scenario happening anymore where we get that kind of old man's beard seed snow in autumn, but we've probably still got several juveniles through the site. We've also focused on pampas, which is an increasing problem, being a forestry area. That will probably diminish as we get canopy closure. Tasmanian blackwoods were originally planted at the eastern end of the site. We got the big trees removed, but there's still quite a seed bank. Blackwood seeds last in the soil for decades, and they like disturbance. So we are seeing some re-establishment of blackwoods. And we have willows, particularly at the far end, the eastern end of the site. Within the actual restoration area we worked in, we don't have a lot of willows. And because we have wetlands and the impact that willows can have, we've been quite proactive about getting rid of as many of the willows as we can. We also have a range of other woody weeds, blackberry, broom, gorse, honeysuckle, that are kind of ubiquitous across the site. Where we were doing revegetation work, we got rid of these plants, but across the rest of the site, we just left them. Unless you're actually going to restore the area, there's no point taking them out because they'll just come back and probably with more of a vengeance. The reason I've highlighted Himalayan honeysuckle is that I am a bit concerned. It had a really good season last year. The numbers and size of plants is increasing, and it's relatively shade tolerant. Things like your gorse will be shaded out once we get canopy closure, but honeysuckle can survive under a canopy that's not yet fully closed. So it will persist in the site for a while. In terms of the pests, we have a limited number of possums. So we did some possum control and some stoat control and also wasps. But really our biggest pest animal that is really having a significant impact are pigs. And we had a really wet spring in this part of the world last year, and that kicked off the pig population, just exploded. We've had trapping, we've had hunting, and it's really not making a dent in the population. So you can see around some of our plantings that they are completely disrespectful of what we're trying to do. They just go through and disrupt all the plantings. We've got several plants in areas that are completely buried, and so it really is quite frustrating. In the intact forest in the top right, they're also churning up the soil. And what that means is we lose our understory. We lose our recruits, we lose our litter layer, and we get that soil disturbance. And none of that is healthy for our forests. And from what I've been reading lately, increasing populations of pigs are problematic right across the country, and we really do need some good solutions for it. at this stage, all I can do is growl about it. So now I'm going to focus more on what we've done with the restoration after fire. Our New Zealand forests aren't particularly well adapted to fire. Fire was never a big part of our ecology pre-human. There's very few natural ignition sources. We don't get the dry lightning strikes, for example, that you might get in Australia. So our forest species hadn't adapted to fire, but they are adapted to other types of disturbance. As our climate warms, with increasing fragmentation of our forests and with increasing human activity, we're going to find that that risk of fires increases, and we are seeing this already. So when we set up the project, we figured that Teapot Valley provided a really cool opportunity to try and understand what happens after fire. In presenting these data and in the reports that we've provided, there is a caveat. Teapot Valley is one case study. It's one site, one fire event at one point in time on that post-fire trajectory. And there is surrounding forest, and that makes a huge difference. So this is at the base of one of the burnt hills. We've got reasonably good intact forest still here, and you can see that we're starting to get regeneration happening amongst our native species. So in order to know exactly what was happening, we set up a field trial with some paired subplots. Each of those subplots was 5 metres by 10 metres. And in February 2023, which is 4 years post-fire, we went and counted the number of native woody recruits. And we were only focusing on the woody species, so trees and shrubs. A few months later, we then went in and very carefully removed all the woody weeds from one subplot in each pair. So that was mainly our gorse and honeysuckle. And then came back and reassessed the plots at 6 years post-fire, so in February this year. So what we were trying to understand is what species regenerate after fire, what sort of numbers do we get regenerating, and does removing woody weeds from these areas promote the natural regeneration of our native woody species? Answering that last question first, no, removing woody weeds had absolutely no impact on the number of woody recruits or the species diversity recruiting. So shout out to Isaline Jardine if she's online. She's done all the stats for us on this, and there really was no significant, statistically significant impact of that weeding. However, what we did find that the cover of exotic grasses and to some extent the exotic herbs was significant in impacting on our recruits. So as the cover of grass and herbs increased, we got fewer recruits. At this site, our dominant grass is Yorkshire fog, Holcus lanatus, and it can form quite dense swards, particularly in wetter areas. And I'm thinking what's happening is it's outcompeting our seedlings at the very first establishment phase. So if you look at the photo here on the left, you've got a patch of really dense grass here, not a lot happening. Over here, where it's a bit more open, we've got coprosmas and mahoe and a whole range of species establishing. The little seedling up here in the top corner is toru, Myrcene salicina. We didn't get a lot of them, but we did have a reasonable number of species actually regenerating. So 4 years post-fire, we had about 3,000 recruits across 34 different species. By 2025, which is 6 years post-fire, we're up to more than 8,000 recruits across 44 different species. 8,000 recruits is equivalent to about 33,000 stems per hectare. So we are actually getting a large number of native trees and shrubs recruiting through this site. In terms of the species, in 2023, mahoe was dominant. By 2025, karamu had taken that crown. Karamu, or Coprosma robusta, had an amazing season in 2024-25. the good spring rain and then rain again in January really kicked it on. I think over 4,000 of our seedlings were kanamu in 2025. A number of other shrubby species also were quite abundant, so other Caprosma species, Kanuka, Makumako, our wineberry, Putaputaweta or marble leaf, and then tall mingi. All of those were quite abundant. Amongst the trees, black beech and hard beech have come back in reasonable numbers. There's a little bit of silver beech as well, and silver fern. So the photo shows some of the beech regen and some of the shrub regen that's happening right on the forest edge, and that's where we see a lot of our regeneration happening in that kind of transition zone. But the silver ferns, the tree ferns overall, were also providing a really interesting little dynamic. I think what must have happened during the fire is that in areas that were less, where the fire was less intense, that the fronds were burnt off the mature tree ferns, but the stems actually stayed intact. And over the time, over the 6 years since the fire, the fronds have re-established, so we get a healthy canopy. And what we're finding underneath these tree ferns is that we are getting a little microsite where we're getting a lot of recruitment happening. So these tree ferns, and they might be an individual plant or they might be a group of, half a dozen tree ferns in an area, are creating these little islands of regeneration. And that's supporting and protecting quite a diversity of our other native trees and shrubs. And so they're kind of acting as stepping stones across the landscape, particularly those that are out in the areas that are more open and where it was burnt. So we get these little pockets of regen happening with the tree ferns. I don't know the reasons why. I have a couple of theories. One is that they're providing some physical protection, so protection potentially from frosts or wind to some extent. Whether the soil in those areas is providing a much healthier kind of microclimate, so a really healthy soil microbial community, or whether it's the fact that the tree ferns themselves are providing perching sites for birds so that they can deposit seed. It could well be a combination of all of those or other things happening. Our trial only looked at woody species, but we are also getting good establishment of herbaceous species after the fire. So in this photo here, you can see this grassy thing is cutting sedge, Garnia pauciflora, and that's come up really well across a lot of the site. It's a great plant because it's quite big, it holds space, so it can outcompete some of the weeds. So in terms of the key messages about natural regeneration post-fire, it can and does happen with our native species, which is really encouraging. As I say, we've got 44 different species, 6 years post-fire, where we're finding recruits. We don't know whether or not we will be able to restore that full diversity. It is possible that further down the track, there might need to be some interplanting to restore the full suite of species we would expect. But at this stage, it is progressing quite well. I mean, obviously, any restoration post-fire is a decadal process. It's going to take many, many years to fully restore. Having the proximity of forest around has been really important, I believe. Partly having mature plants provides a seed source, so that seed doesn't have to travel particularly far. It also supports a really healthy bird population, and we have a lot of tui and kiruru on site, as well as other species, and they'll be dispersing seed into the open areas. And that forest also provides perching spots, so particularly on the edge of the forest where we're getting a lot of regen, then some of that's probably from birds perching and then depositing their little packages of seed and fertiliser and providing a good environment. All of that's happening above ground, but I also think what's happening below ground is going to be critical as well. Our forests need to have healthy soil, healthy microbial communities supporting them. That intact forest has got that healthy microbial community and can provide the propagules, the spores and small animals that can move out into the burnt areas. We don't know how intense the fire was across the site and whether those soil microbial communities were completely destroyed, or in some areas they probably survived the fire. But there will be spores in the soil that will have rejuvenated since the fire. So having that healthy intact forest, having healthy soils means that regeneration after fire is going to progress more rapidly. Again, there's a heap more information in part 2 of the final report. Okay, so moving on to direct seeding, which really is about taking agricultural techniques and applying them to native revegetation. It's about putting our seed directly out in the site that we want to revegetate. You can either do it by hand, using machinery, or by drones. The 2 photos there are different types of agricultural machinery that's been modified to allow for native seed to be dispersed. Why would we do direct seeding? Well, it's a lot cheaper. The cost of seed is a lot lower than the equivalent cost of plants, and getting that seed into the ground is a lot faster and cheaper. So if you look at the top photo here with the 4-wheel drive driving across a paddock, revegetating, you can imagine that one person in a 4-wheel drive is going to be able to revegetate at several hectares in a day, way more than you can plant. So the cost of your plant materials and the cost of getting them in the ground is way lower. But, and this is a very big but, it's a lot riskier way of getting plants established. If you sow seed in the nursery into a nice seed raising mix, give it decent water, bit of warmth, it's a great environment for a seed to germinate and a seedling to establish. Put it out in the real world and life is a lot tougher. So we get far fewer seedlings from the same amount of seed. I don't think direct seeding is ever going to be the full answer for a re-veg program, but it can get us started. We can do it on a large scale, so the 4-wheel drive at the top, like I say, can do several hectares in a day. You can do it on a small scale in your backyard. It's probably only going to be suitable for a small suite of species in New Zealand. We haven't done a lot of work here on it. My feeling is that there's probably only going to be a handful of our pioneer species, things like Kanuka and Manuka and some of our coprosmids, for example, that will be suitable for sowing. But as I say, it's a way to get our re-veg underway. If we can get some of those pioneer species into our sites relatively cheaply and easily, they can start to progress that transformation of our system back into a native dominated system. Then you can go in and interplant, or there might be natural regen happening. What it does is allow you to do more regeneration or revegetation for the cost. So it actually stretches your re-veg dollar. I'm going to talk about the trials that we've done. Again, there's a caveat. We were working in areas that have been previously forested prior to the fire. If you are taking a pasture area that's been in pasture for decades, it is going to be a lot more challenging to really get direct seeding to operate. So we set up a couple of field trials. We cleared the areas that we wanted to sow. Getting rid of any weed competition is really critical to ensuring that you can maximise your success with direct seeding. On the days that we sowed, we created little furrows using hand tools, just a rake or a grubber. The idea of creating a furrow for your seed is it protects the seed from wind, but it also is an area that retains moisture. So for an establishing seedling in those very first vulnerable few days and weeks, you've got a slightly higher level of soil moisture, which can be critical. We hand sowed in both spring 2023 and 24. I really would have liked to have done a trial in autumn 24, but we were in a declared drought in this part of the world and there was just no point. After sowing, we just put a little layer of soil on the seed mix and then used a rake to tamp it down. You want to make sure that there's good soil-seed contact. We came back at 3 months after sowing and hand weeded the lines and then assessed our lines further down the track. In 2023, we sowed 2 different seed mixes, each with 6 species, and we were playing around with plots on the hill slopes. 2024, we decreased the number of species that we sowed, so only 1 seed mix with 6 species, but we included riparian plots. If you are interested in doing this, it's a really good idea to test the seed for viability. And the easiest way to do it is to test it in a nursery or even in your backyard. Just sow some seed in a seed tray and see what comes up. Because if seed doesn't come up in the field, you need to know whether or not it was the seed that you put out that was problematic or whether there are other limitations in the system. We sowed a mix of seed and fruit. For some species, it's really difficult to remove the seed from the fruit. So things like mahoe and cabbage tree, tikuka, we just sowed the whole fruit. They're relatively small, so it's not a big deal. We only sowed sort of between 1 and 2 grams of seed mix per metre of line, which really isn't very much. And so if you're going to do it, you need some sort of carrier to enable you to actually sow the seed across the area that you're sowing. We had a good supply of totara sawdust, so we used that. You can use other sawdust or sand or something that will allow you to actually spread that seed evenly. It's worth putting a control into your system. So having an area where you treat exactly the same, but the only difference is you don't sow seed. So for us, it was a series of lines that had been prepared the same way as everything else, but on the day we only sowed with sawdust and there was no seed in that sawdust. And that allows you to understand how much recruitment is going to happen regardless. So whether it's from the soil seed bank or seed that comes in later, you need to know what would have happened if you hadn't sowed your seed. We also put in a control with some lines that weren't weeded in 2024. What did we find? Well, in both 2023 and 24, we had really good establishment of manuka, karamu again, so Caprosma robusta, and then there's a little dude down here, which is one of our cabbage trees, tikuka. Those were the 3 species that did best. In our assessments, we set out a tape measure and then recorded the position of each of the seedlings along the line so we could actually follow individual seedlings over time. And we also used skewers, so the pink and the blue there are skewers, just like kebab skewers, with horticultural tape tucked on the top so that we could come back and find our seedlings again. So in terms of numbers, with the 2023 trial at 6 months after sowing, we had 240 seedlings. 18 months later, it was about 360. 2024 trial, at 6 months, we had close to 2,000 seedlings. Yes, we sowed a little bit more seed, but not a lot more. The difference was rain. As I say, we had a very wet spring in 2024 and then really good rain in January, and that really kicked everything on. But regardless of actual numbers, the 3 species that did well in our trials were karamu, manuka, and the tikuka, the cabbage tree. 2024, we also sowed some totara, and we had a few of those coming up, which is very exciting. If we can get totara to direct seed, then that's a huge win. A little bit of makamaka, wineberry, and kanuka. A lot less kanuka than I expected, and this is why doing the nursery trial is worth it, because when we sowed that same seed in seed trays, we also got a very poor strike rate. And that is a bit puzzling because the seed was collected on site and there's a lot of regen of Kānuka across the site. So whether that seed collection, it was a poor year for viability for Kānuka, I'm not sure. The plants that have established are doing pretty well. So at 18 months, our tallest plant from the 2023 trial is 80 centimetres tall. It's a manuka. So they are well established. In terms of our little weeding experiment, lines that were weeded, our seedlings had better growth, but we didn't get more seedling numbers. However, I think that comes back to the soil moisture issue. There really was sufficient soil moisture to support both our seedlings and weeds. If soil moisture is limiting, then weeding will probably be needed. The other thing I want to point out is from the 2023 trial, we actually had more seedlings at 18 months post-sowing than we did at 6 months post-sowing. When you sow seed, it doesn't all come up at once, and particularly with our native species. Plants are evolved to kind of germinate and establish over time. So if you do try this and you don't get any results, give it time. Some of our seed is obviously taking 12, 15, 18 months to germinate, and there may still be seed that's viable that's still sitting there waiting for the ideal conditions to germinate. So in terms of the take-home messages, as a proof of concept, I think we can say pretty confidently that it is possible to directly seed some of our native species. It's a way to kickstart our restoration. It's one tool in the toolbox. It is not a silver bullet. It will be part of the process, but it will not be the whole process. We're likely to have to augment any direct seeding with additional species, whether we actually go in and actively replant or allow for natural regen, in order to restore that full diversity that we want across our forest communities. We really need more data and information about what species it's appropriate for, how much to sow, when to sow, how to sow. So if you are interested in direct seeding, then can I please encourage you, do try this at home. And if you do try it at home or in an area that you are responsible for, then keep good records. Keep a record of what you sowed, where you got your seed from, how much seed you sowed, what you did, and then what results you got. And share that information. Share it with your land care group, your community group, with your council, with other people, so that we can start to get some of this information more widely known. The full results for our direct seeding work are in part 4 of our final report. But I've also developed a little fact sheet with some tips and tricks if you are interested in doing it at home. And to close, the resources that I've been talking about are all available on Tasman District Council's website. So if you go into your search engine and type in Tasman District Council, once you're on the website in the search box, search for Teapot, then that will bring you to this web address. There are several reports there, so annual reports from 2022 through to 2025. The 2025 report is quite big, so I've broken it into 5 different PDFs, each one a separate topic area. If you do read more than one of them, you'll discover that the first 20 pages or so is identical. So all the information about the project, the structure of the findings, and the exec summary are repeated in each PDF, so that each PDF is a standalone document. I've also developed some fact sheets there on the website. I currently have a TDC email address, but that's probably not going to last beyond June next year. So if you want to get hold of me after that, you can try my Ecologic address. Thank you very much. Back to you, Emma.
Oh, thanks, Fiona. That was really interesting. I posted that link into the chat for anyone who wants to grab that. And we'll also send an email out to everyone who registered with a recording of this webinar and a link to those reports as well. a number of people couldn't make it today. So we'll send out the recording and that link if anyone wants to follow up. So there was just one question posted in the chat from Timothy Curran, I think from Lincoln University. Did you see any species resprouting, or were you just looking at recovery via seed?
I don't know. We were looking at anything that had recruited. We weren't able to tell if it was a seedling or a resprout. For some species, I suspect some of it may have been resprouts. Other things were definitely seed. In the report, I have put a table together with the information from work from the Port Hills, which outlines which of our native species are likely to resprout after fire. So there was a literature review was done quite recently. So that link is in the report, so people can follow up on that. But we weren't able to distinguish between seeds and resprouts.
Okay. Fantastic. Great to see such a good range of people here. It's been good to see that in the chat. Lots of councils from all over the country and individual projects and research institutions and stuff. So I'm sure Fiona would be happy to take any follow-up questions if anyone wants to get in touch. And as I said, we'll email out you all the link to those reports and the recording of this webinar.
Hang on, Emma, sorry, there is another question that's come up.
Oh, has it?
Warwick Allen has asked the design of the weeding treatment in the natural regen area. So with the natural regen trial, Warwick, we took out the woody weeds once. So we assessed for all the recruits that we could find. Then the following spring, we cut and painted all the woody weeds. So as I say, primarily gorse and honeysuckle. And that was that. We just did that the once. Replication, we had 48 paired subplots, so 24 weeded, 24 unweeded. Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and I'll close us off with a karakia and let you all get back to your Fridays. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ethawhai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te araha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairoa tapu. Aki, 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 amene. Thanks everyone.